At 1:44 a.m., someone tapped on the glass of my security kiosk. The problem was, I'm stationed on the 42nd floor of a half-finished skyscraper, and there are no external walkways, just a sheer drop into the freezing city wind. I didn't look up immediately. I couldn't. My eyes stayed fixed on the logbook, watching my own hand tremble as the pen leaked a small, dark blotch onto the page. The sound hadn't been a bird or a piece of debris hitting the glass. It was rhythmic, 3 distinct knuckles-on-glass raps. It was the sound of someone asking to be let in. But at 400 feet in the air, in a building that's still mostly steel girders and open air, there isn't anyone out there. If there is, they aren't human. My name is Mark. I've been working night shift security for The Reach. That's the marketing name for this luxury high-rise project downtown, for about 4 months. Most people think night security is about catching burglars or chasing off urban explorers. In a skeletal skyscraper, it's mostly about silence. You spend 8 hours a night listening to the building groan. Steel expands and contracts. The wind whistles through elevator shafts like a giant flute. You get used to it. You learn to filter out the mechanical screams of the structure. But you never get used to a human sound where humans aren't supposed to be. The 42nd floor is unique because it's the staging floor. It's where the crew keeps the expensive finishes, the Italian marble, the custom glass panels, the high-end appliances. Because of the value of the materials, they keep a guard stationed right there on the floor in a temporary plywood kiosk, rather than just having us patrol the lobby. It's a lonely post. The floor is mostly open to the elements, with heavy plastic sheeting draped over the gaps where the floor-to-ceiling windows haven't been installed yet. When the wind catches that plastic, it sounds like 1,000 wings flapping at once. I sat there for 5 minutes, frozen. My kiosk is a small, heated box with 3 plexiglass windows. One looks toward the interior elevator bank, one looks across the dark expanse of the floor, and the third looks directly toward the exterior edge of the building. That's where the sound came from, the exterior. I finally forced myself to look. The city lights below were a blur of orange and white, obscured by a light drizzle. There was nothing on the ledge. Of course there wasn't. The ledge is only 4 inches wide. No one could stand there. I let out a long, shaky breath and leaned back, trying to convince myself it was just a loose piece of crane cable swinging in the wind. But then, the walkie-talkie on my belt chirped. It was Davis, the guy at the lobby desk 42 stories below. "Mark, you awake up there?" His voice crackled. He sounded bored, which was normal for Davis. "Yeah, I'm here," I said, my voice sounding tighter than I wanted it to. "Just hearing things. The wind is pretty bad tonight." "Tell me about it," Davis replied. "Hey, did you leave something in the service elevator? Sensor says the doors on 42 have been obstructed for the last 2 minutes." I looked over at the elevator bank about 50 feet away. The service elevator was the only one operational. The doors were shut. The floor indicator light showed it was parked right here on 42. "No," I said. "The doors are closed, Davis. I'm looking right at them." "That's weird. My board says they're stuck open." "Hold on, let me reset the circuit." I watched the elevator indicator. It flickered. Then, with a heavy mechanical thud that echoed through the entire floor, the elevator doors slid open. The elevator was empty. The bright, clinical LED light from inside the cab spilled out onto the dusty concrete floor of the 42nd floor, creating a long, rectangular patch of light. "Okay, they're open now," Davis said. "See anything?" "Empty," I told him. "Just a glitch, I guess." "Right. Well, keep an eye on it. The foreman gets pissed if we burn out the motors." The radio went silent. I watched the elevator. Protocol said I should walk over and press the closed door button if they stayed open, but I didn't want to leave the kiosk. There was something about the way that light hit the floor. It made the shadows in the rest of the room look deeper, more solid. As I stared, a shadow moved. It wasn't a quick movement. It was slow, a deliberate shift in the darkness near the stacks of marble crates. It looked like a person crouching down, tucking themselves behind the wood. My heart started that heavy, rhythmic thumping that makes your ears ring. We've had issues with rooftopers, kids who climb these buildings for the adrenaline and the Instagram photos, but they usually stay on the roof. They don't hide on the staging floors. "Who's there?" I shouted. My voice was swallowed up by the wind whistling through the plastic sheeting. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and stepped out of the kiosk. The air on the floor was freezing, smelling of wet cement and sawdust. I clicked the light on. The beam was strong, cutting through the darkness. I swept it toward the crates. Nothing, just wood and plastic wrap. I walked toward the elevator, keeping my back to the interior core of the building. I wanted to close those doors and get back to my heater. As I reached the elevator, I stepped into the light of the cab. The elevator was lined with protective plywood to keep the walls from getting scratched. Someone had written something on the plywood in black permanent marker. It wasn't there during my 11 p.m. rounds. "Stay in the light." The letters were frantic, shaky. Below it, there was a drawing of a floor plan. It took me a second to realize it was the floor plan for the 42nd floor. There was a small X marked exactly where my security kiosk was, and another X marked at the edge of the building where the windows were missing. A line was drawn between the two X's, and next to the line a single word: "Watch." My stomach did a slow, cold roll. This wasn't a kid. This felt like a warning. I looked back at my kiosk. From this angle, I could see the exterior window I'd heard the tapping on. There was a handprint on the glass. It was a wet, muddy handprint, pressed firmly against the outside of the pane. Not a smear, but a perfect impression of a palm and 5 long fingers. I pulled my radio up. "Davis, come in." "Davis." Nothing but static. The elevator lights flickered once, twice, and then they died. The entire floor was plunged into total darkness, save for the narrow beam of my flashlight. The silence was absolute. The wind had stopped. No whistling, no flapping plastic. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing. And then, from the darkness near the edge of the building, came a sound. It sounded like someone dragging a heavy piece of metal across the concrete. I swung my light toward the sound. The beam hit a figure. It was standing about 30 feet away, right at the edge of the drop-off. It was tall, wearing a high-visibility construction vest that was shredded and filthy. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, facing the open air, its back to me. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Security, don't move." The figure didn't flinch. It slowly started to turn around. I've seen some things in my life. I grew up in a rough neighborhood. I've seen accidents, but I wasn't prepared for this. The man, if it was a man, didn't have a face. Not in the way you'd expect. It was as if his head had been wrapped tightly in that same semi-transparent plastic sheeting we used for the windows. I could see the vague, distorted shapes of features beneath it, a flattened nose, a mouth locked in a permanent O shape, but it was all blurred, suffocated. He was holding a piece of rebar. He began to drag it again, walking toward me with a strange, hitching gait, like his legs didn't quite bend at the knees. I didn't think. I ran. I didn't run for the elevator. It was dead anyway. I ran for the emergency stairs. I hit the heavy fire door and threw myself into the stairwell, slamming it shut behind me and throwing the manual bolt. My breath was coming in short, painful gasps. I leaned against the door, listening. Clang. He hit the door with the rebar. Just once. Then silence. I started down the stairs. I didn't care about the job. I didn't care about my gear in the kiosk. I just wanted to be on the ground. I ran down 3 flights, the metal stairs ringing under my boots. 41, 40, 39. On the 38th floor landing, I stopped. The door to the 38th floor was open. Not just cracked, but wide open. And sitting right in the middle of the landing was my thermos. The one I'd left inside my kiosk on the 42nd floor. It was still steaming. I backed away from the door, my flashlight beam dancing wildly. There was no way. I'd been in the stairwell for 30 seconds. No one could have gotten from the 42nd floor to the 38th that fast. Especially not a man with a hitching gait dragging a metal bar. I looked down the center of the stairwell, the gap between the railings that goes all the way to the bottom. Down in the darkness, 40 stories below, a light was moving. A flashlight. "Davis?" I whispered. The light down there began to spiral. Someone was spinning it around, faster and faster. Then a voice drifted up. It was distorted by the echoes of the concrete shaft, but I could hear it. "Mark, You left the door open. Mark. It sounded like Davis, but the cadence was wrong. It was too rhythmic, too mechanical. I didn't go down. I couldn't. If that thing was below me, and the man with the rebar was above me, I was trapped in the middle of a vertical concrete tube. I ducked onto the 38th floor. It was a mirror of the 42nd, but without the crates of marble. Just empty rooms and sprawling shadows. I needed a place to hide. I found a utility closet near the core of the building and squeezed inside, shutting the door and clicking off my light. I sat there in the pitch black. My phone had no service. The steel structure acted like a Faraday cage. I just had to wait for morning. 5 hours. I just had to stay quiet for 5 hours. That's when I felt it. The closet was small, maybe 4 feet deep. As I sat there, I felt a draft. A cold, wet draft hitting the back of my neck. I reached back, my fingers trembling, and felt the wall. It wasn't drywall. It was plastic sheeting. I realized then that this closet didn't have a back wall. It was an access point for the HVAC ducts that hadn't been finished. It opened directly into the ceiling plenum of the floor below. And something was breathing on the other side of that plastic. It wasn't a human breath. It was a wet, crinkling sound. Crinkle, hiss, crinkle, hiss, like air being forced through a plastic bag. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening to that wet hiss crinkle. Then a hand pressed against the plastic from the other side. Because the plastic was thin and the light from the floor was dim, I could see the silhouette. It was the same long, 5-fingered hand. It began to trace the outline of my head through the plastic. "Stay in the light," a voice whispered. It was right in my ear, separated only by a millimeter of polyethylene. "The light is for the ones who still have faces." I burst out of the closet. I didn't look back. I ran toward the edge of the building. I knew there was a construction hoist, an external cage elevator, on the north side. If I could reach it, I could bypass the stairs entirely. I reached the edge. The wind was back, howling now, whipping the plastic sheets into a frenzy. I saw the hoist. It was parked at the 38th floor. Thank God. I jumped into the cage and slammed the gate. I hit the down switch. Nothing happened. I hit it again, and again. I looked up at the motor housing. The cables had been cut. They weren't just snapped, they were frayed, as if someone had spent a long time sawing through them with a dull blade. The only thing holding the cage up was the emergency brake, and it was groaning under the weight. I looked through the mesh of the cage back onto the 38th floor. The man with the plastic face was standing there. He wasn't dragging the rebar anymore. He was holding something else. It was Davis's security jacket. It was soaked in something dark. He didn't move toward me. He just stood at the edge of the abyss, watching me. He raised his hand, the one that had traced my head, and pointed down. The emergency brake snapped. The fall felt like it lasted a lifetime. It wasn't like the movies. There was no screaming, just the stomach-flipping sensation of weightlessness, and the sound of the wind rushing past the metal mesh. I hit the 20th floor safety netting. These buildings have heavy-duty nylon nets every 20 floors to catch falling debris or, God forbid, workers. It saved my life, but the impact was brutal. I felt 2 of my ribs snap instantly. The netting sagged, bouncing me like a rag doll before I finally settled in the center of the mesh, suspended 200 feet above the street. I lay there, staring up at the dark silhouette of the building. I could see the 38th floor. A small, flickering light appeared at the edge. It was my flashlight. He was looking down at me. He dropped the flashlight. It tumbled through the air, spinning, a tiny needle of light in the darkness, until it shattered on the pavement far below. I spent the rest of the night tangled in that net. Every time the wind blew, the net would sway, and I'd feel the broken ends of my ribs grinding together. I didn't dare call out. I didn't want him to know I was still alive. When the sun finally began to bleed over the horizon, the construction crew arrived. They found me screaming for help, half delirious with pain and hypothermia. They hauled me in. They called an ambulance. The police came to the hospital to take a statement. I told them everything. The tapping, the elevator, the man in the plastic. They went to the building. They checked the 42nd floor. My kiosk was there. My gear was there. My thermos was on the desk, cold and half full. There were no handprints on the glass. There was no writing in the elevator. And Davis? They found Davis in the lobby. He was fine. He told the police that I'd never answered my radio after 1 a.m. He said he'd watched the monitors all night, and he'd seen me walk out of my kiosk at 1:44 a.m., walk to the edge of the building and jump. He showed them the footage. In the video, you can see me. I look calm. I walk to the edge of the 42nd floor, not the 38th, and I just step off. There's no one else in the frame. No man with a rebar. No plastic. But there's one thing the police couldn't explain. When they processed the suicide footage, they zoomed in on my face right before I stepped off the ledge. In the video, I'm not Mark. I'm wearing a high-visibility vest, and my head is wrapped tightly in semi-transparent plastic. I haven't gone back to work. I moved out of the city. I work in a warehouse now, on the day shift. It's bright. There are people everywhere. I never go higher than the ground floor. But sometimes, when I'm in the shower and the steam gets thick on the glass door, I see the shape of a hand. A long, 5-fingered hand, pressing against the other side. And last night, I found a black permanent marker on my kitchen table. I don't own any markers. I picked it up, and without even thinking about it, I wrote 3 words on the palm of my hand. Not the light. I don't know what it means, and I'm terrified that one night, I'm going to wake up and find out that I'm the one who stayed in the building. And the person living my life right now is just a silhouette behind the plastic.